One day, a treasure map just popped into existence. They said that Han Gong hid the legendary martial arts and secret weapon of Qi Manhwa, the greatest fighter in Murim history, and that was the spark that would finally ignite the long silence of the Murim world. Suddenly, a mountain cracked open and a boy stepped out, shouting that he had finally escaped the cave. The sky was still blue, or at least it looked like it was. He guessed the shock of leaving the place might be why he couldn't remember his life before he walked inside, no matter how hard he tried. Even so, he had to remember this vision from when he was 10, when an old man named Chang Jija told him that 10 years later they would have to save the world, no matter how hard it was to believe. Qi and Jija gathered a crowd of 100 children, and the boy was right there among them. He still remembered the calm eyes of that old man, who told him to do exactly what he said. He also explained that the next day they would begin martial arts training, and the boy felt no fear because, as an orphan, he had nothing left to lose. Chang'e warned that anyone trying to get away would be trapped by a rock wall blocking the cave exit, and anyone trying to come in would face the same deadly danger. He controlled everything, from when they ate to when they slept, leaving them unable to do anything for themselves. Their very first lesson was how to breathe, mastering the three energies to draw power from the sky, the ground, and people themselves, followed by learning how to wield the three-energy sword, take the three-energy step, and even walk, all taught only by Chang Jija. Maybe 3 years went by before he called them back to tell them that their martial arts could lead them to the realm of the martial gods. And then for the next 7 years, they all trained hard to master these skills so they could open that door and step inside together. To stop a disaster from destroying the world, they had to train without any doubt or fear. Then they stepped into the dark cave and found themselves trapped inside. The boy understood why they had to keep living in that terrible place. Everything happened because of Qian Gisha, who made them train without stopping inside the cave, just as he had commanded. The thick mist in the room wasn't just fog, but concentrated power that made the arts grow stronger every single day until the energy was so heavy it tore holes in the very fabric of space, opening strange doorways to other worlds. Dark, evil creatures stormed into the cave. On that day, they faced a gate to hell and fought a brutal nightmare for their lives, proving that the power of the three energies was truly useful. But even with that knowledge, only that boy survived, which made him the one everyone had to choose. He remembered his name, Dan Henu. Later, Dan stepped into a dining hall at the Cloud Pavilion, where a woman of high status took notice of him. The guard noticed she was walking around with a sword that had no covering on its blade. Another man noticed that the sword looked truly amazing. After a long wait, Dan finally sat down to eat. He had no clue how long it had been since he last ate something real. He ate with such a huge appetite that the other hungry customers ended up ordering noodles right along with him. The young lady couldn't help but wonder why that man stood out so much to her. Just as the waiter reached for the bill, Dan realized he had completely forgotten what money was. The waiter warned that eating meant paying. Dan looked back at us and said he didn't have a thing to give. Then the waiter asked for the sword as payment, but Dan said he couldn't give it to him. It was the very sword he exchanged to save his final friend's life. The waiter asked if he'd meant to eat for free all along, while people were already rising to collect the bill. Then a young lady stepped up with cash, offering to pay right then and there. She moved closer to Dan, who questioned her actions, expecting him to speak up in that moment. Seeing him up close, she was sure his eyes held the pure wonder of a child discovering the world for the first time. Dan tried to speak, but just walked away, and she saw right through it. Everyone was whispering about how strange it was that he didn't even say thank you. The young lady's brother told her he was just a homeless wanderer who didn't appreciate anything. She spotted his amazing handmade sword, but realized walking around with it unsheathed would surely cause trouble. So, she decided to follow him since he needed a sheath. Walking down the street, Dan finally realized he should have said thank you back then, but it was too late. Later, when we returned to the Cloud Pavilion, it was packed with martial artists. The young woman they'd seen earlier, named Zhou Se Ho Han, said the Murim Alliance had a truly amazing pull on everyone. Zhou, the clan leader's son and brother, nodded in agreement, admitting he never thought the Alliance's own boss would act. Sima Chao, the head of the Zhou escort group, explained that the Alliance, the Orthodox faction, and the Forest Bandits were all moving toward Hangshan, but that was just part of the story. Everyone was drawn to the Murim's legendary martial artist, Chun Jija, because his unmatched skill, secret weapon moves, and ability to sense the flow of energy made him a powerhouse everyone wanted to follow. In his last days, Chun Jija invented the Shadow Lightning Blade and drove the world into madness with his hidden weapons, before teaching a simple beggar to become a master of this deadly art in just 3 years. That martial artist was hunted as a public enemy until he met a terrible and miserable end. But that incident only made everyone want to find Chung Jija and learn his secrets. So many groups of the Murim hunted him down, yet he vanished without a trace. Sim Michelle guessed that the Zhou clan leader had found the treasure map hiding Chennage's martial art, so it made sense that everyone in Murim would want it too. And since he was there at their request, nothing bad should happen, but they still needed to stay careful because unpredictable things can happen anywhere. The second Dan walked into the restaurant, everything exploded. Joyne asked if she was really going after that strange beggar, arguing that he had no manners, no decency, and that her kindness would be wasted on him. Simmel nodded, knowing it was too risky to walk alone right now since the leader was also on his way. So, Hyen said it was all good and that she'd just stay there. Dan wandered a bit lost through the busy, crowded city, watching merchants and street performers. Everything was calm and peaceful, with happy mothers enjoying their playful children. Then, he recalled the promise he and his best friend had made to each other. They would leave that place alive. Aksajai begged them to swear that if they survived, they would go to his home and tell his father. Dan promised he'd be the one to tell him. Axie said yes, but begged him not to die. That day, Dan was caught off guard. A beast nearly got the best of him. But Axie stepped forward and took the blow meant for someone else. Dan told him to stand up and ask why he did that when they had promised to meet his father. Axie said that out of everyone, Dan was the strongest and had to keep living to tell his dad he was sorry. Dan stared at the full moon and felt his freedom was a terrible price paid with the lives of 99 people. He owed them all and promised that Cao and Jija would pay them back. He kept walking until he found himself back at that same restaurant. She was still there, but he also saw that at night, a huge group of martial warriors had left with her walking right beside them. Then Dan made up his mind to follow them. The group halted deep in the forest late that night, taking a break right at the entrance of Henan. Dan saw that everyone was walking back toward the very place where he started. The group behind them was heading to the same place, looking for something specific too. While the Murim Alliance's advisor, Jigel Yongchun, spoke with leader Du-Woon about the dangerous shift in the unorthodox alliance and Green Forest bandits. A worried Du felt his instincts dulling to their new target, just as warriors like Pang of the Flying Dragon approached Se-Hon to ask if she needed a rest. Her brother said everything was okay and told them to just leave them alone. Suddenly, a gang of bandits came charging right up. They were the Green Forest bandits, ruled by a blood-drinking demon who claimed he was so good at hiding that he had actually found them. The leader told everyone to get ready. The advisor urged them to be careful, since even a strange new partner had joined their group. De knew that the blood-drinking demon was a master of the Marshall family, a foe who would be hard to beat. As the fight started, the blood-drinking demon tore apart the weaker soldiers with brutal kicks that snapped necks and a huge blade, then turned his attention to Du-Woon, and their swords smashed together. The soldiers on the Murim Alliance side were fighting each other and losing badly because they were outnumbered. The blood-drinking demon asked if they were in trouble and told them that the secret weapon left by Giza was now theirs to use. Dan, still hiding, wondered if he had really heard the name Giza. He wedged his sword's point under a rock and flung it onto the battlefield. He smashed it apart with sharp cuts, used the pieces to draw their eyes away, and then ended everyone under the falling shower of shards. Once he leaped into the fray, he didn't hesitate to ask where Giza was. Du was shocked that he hadn't felt the boy's presence at all. The advisor thanked him for his help, but wondered why he was looking for Giza here since he passed away 10 years ago. Dan couldn't believe they were really gone since his friends' deaths still went unpunished. Suddenly, a terrifying power surged out of Dan and froze the Murim Alliance warriors in their tracks, as if they had been swallowed by an unstoppable force. Dan had survived a long, painful time and finally escaped that hell. But now his revenge target was already dead. So even though the void energy threatened to overwhelm the Alliance leader and cause his members to lose control, he had to stop it before they all suffered. Dan saw the young lady, Se-Ho Hyun, the same girl who had once been kind to him, walking up to talk. Dan finally understood that he had only made it out of that hell because of the kindness of his friends. Now that Gizo is gone, he can't get his revenge. Perhaps he'd have to search for them elsewhere. Suddenly, the void energy vanished, and the warriors returned to normal, leaving even the Alliance leader stunned. Dan knew it was a trap even the best couldn't escape, and he couldn't stop wondering just who that kid really was. Se-Ho Hyun asked Dan if he was looking for someone, telling his uncle that this person had helped them and suggesting they travel together to find him, which made Sima feel a little nervous. It was tough to say no to someone who had helped him, but since the Murmur Alliance warriors were twisted by void energy, he wasn't sure if their leader would even let them do it. They figured that boy could wipe out Green Forest and the rogue bandits in a heartbeat. So since they were already taking a heavy toll, it made sense to keep this new threat close by. The Alliance leader finally gave his approval. Sima asked Dan if he'd like to join the escort agency, and the warriors around them were thrilled because that job was an amazing chance for him. Dan shrugged, admitting he had no idea what to do. One person shared that this wasn't just any ordinary spot where anyone could get a job. Dan said he was willing to give it a try, even though he had no idea what an escort agency was. Everyone stared in confusion until the old man explained that the escort agency was just moving people's things and keeping them safe. One of the dragon riders asked the country bumpkin where he came from. Pang pointed out that Dan's sword was overflowing with killing intent and was a rare weapon being wasted on a simple country bumpkin. With everyone's eyes on them, they chose to wait for the alliance leader to enter Hangan before grabbing the sword. When they reached Hangan before the sun fully rose, everyone noticed something strange about the place. Dan couldn't help but question why they were hunting for something there, especially since he had just walked right out of that very spot. The leader of the alliance asked if they were finally going to see Gish's secret manual. The advisor admitted they still hadn't found the cave's entrance, so the warriors searched everywhere in vain. And though the advisor suggested splitting the mountain in two, to refuse because it would ruin the secret manual. Dan knew his own power had already torn their home in half, so he and his friends had to track down the original entrance Giza used, the only spot where they could still feel his energy. Then he searched past every warrior and quickly found the doorway. When asked how he knew where it was, Dan said he used to live there. Pang explained that it made sense to call him a mountain savage, since it wasn't surprising to see him walking around with a bear sword. Do it myself with my advisor and the Flying Dragon Corps leader, while the others hold the line, he told Dan, admitting he owed Dan a debt, but Dan only saw nothing but the memories of death inside. Thinking the boy was spooked, they told him to stay back since they could handle it from there, and then the advisor stepped into the cave with him. Dan believed Jija was truly gone and didn't care what they found inside anymore. Sion stepped up to ask if he truly lived there, but the Flying Dragon group swooped in and blocked Dan's way, with the biggest one claiming he might be a bandit spy, to which Sion quickly insisted that he was not. Hang asked how she could promise that, admitting she was too kind. One warrior claimed that if he were truly innocent, they would have taken his sword, yet it looked old and worn at first glance, though it hummed with incredible power. They demanded that Dan give them the sword. Dan told them the sword belonged to a friend who had passed, and he'd fight to the death rather than let them take it, certain they wouldn't even walk over his body to get it. As the two Flying Dragon warriors charged at him, Dan spotted their plan to attack from the sides, so he simply dodged and slashed both of them down just as they moved in together. He watched their every move like a hawk spotting a mouse. Just as Dan was about to slice them in two, the alliance leader shouted to halt and commanded them to stand guard. People started to wonder if they had truly stumbled upon Giza's secret weapon. Du commanded everyone to fall back, declaring the battle finished. Ping told the country bumpkin he should feel lucky. Sihan's face showed worry, and Dan couldn't understand why she insisted everything was fine. She admitted she was worried because they had never even introduced themselves. Once they said hello, she stepped closer and told them they had to get ready to go. So, the Murim Alliance's search for Giza's secret weapon has stopped for the time being. Back in Hue province, rumors were already flying that the Murim Alliance had found Giza's secret weapon and were about to rule the world with it. Everyone was talking about it. At the Murim Alliance's main headquarters, leader DGO scoffed and declared it absurd, insisting that no one would ever believe them even if they swore Giza's secret weapon didn't exist. He sat in the elders' meeting, knowing the secret weapon was nowhere to be found, but the rumors had already started flying through the alliance. Inside the cave at Hangan, they discovered only a wooden box left by Jija along with a letter. The letter warned that the blood demon would shake the entire Jang kingdom into chaos. So Jija gathered 100 unmatched marshals and begged them to kill the monster before it was too late. To keep those dangerous warriors in check, that strange yin-yang parasite inside the box was the only thing that could hold them back. Jija was sure the blood demon couldn't get away once the box was opened, and sure enough, inside was an orb holding the yin-yang parasite. What made it truly terrifying was that not a single one of the 100 martial artists from the letter could be found. One of the older people asked if everything was just a crazy dream left by Giza. Du shook his head and said that instead, it felt like something bigger was pushing everything forward. But there were also good reasons to doubt. In Henshin, the forest bandits weren't hunting for Gaia's secret weapon at all. They were just trying to hurt the Murim Alliance, and since they never found the weapon, even after seeing many bodies vanish, they let rumors spread through the markets to trick Janghu into thinking the Alliance was the real target. The elders asked who would dare to do such a thing. One of them suggested that they should suspect the head of the Zhou clan, since he was the one who brought the map. He replied that while he didn't trust that man, he feared a spy was hiding inside the Zhou clan. Because the situation was so serious, they had to send a capable person to keep watch on the Zhou clan, since even if the clan wasn't behind everything, traitors might still be using them. Then, back at the Zhou clan's huge estate, the escort agency head returned with the young master and lady, led by Dan, who stared in awe at how enormous the house was. Sima promised to talk to the leader and told someone to bring Dan to the agency. CI had wanted to stop and buy him a sheath on the way. Dan couldn't understand why everyone in that world was so fixated on sheaths, and it just didn't make any sense to him. Hoyan admitted his sheath was already patched up and couldn't stop the sword's power, because it had already shattered into pieces. Dan shook his head and said he didn't need the cover, that he was perfectly fine. Sayo apologized to him for promising to make him a sheath, but then failing to do it. Dan couldn't understand why she was saying sorry, especially since it was exactly what his friend had done right before he died. He told her to stop apologizing because he had heard those words enough. Sima's shock was so great, she shouted for Dan to hurry over while Sayo Hyan lingered behind, unsure if he'd done something wrong. Dan looked around at the busy Renat escort agency and saw that many porters were busy carrying luggage and doing hard work. Sima walked past several people giving orders and told Zhang that he had brought a new porter and that he should take care of him and train him. Zhang Chil promised to be tough on him. Sima thought the guy was too rough, so she told Dan to learn his stuff right and wished him luck. Zhang smiled broadly and told the new recruit brought by the chief that he'd get the same tough training as everyone else, then asked his name to hear Dan's blunt reply. Zhang asked why he sounded so cold, and Dan explained that his arms and legs were just too short. Zhang asked if he was looking for a fight or wanting to die on his very first day. Dan felt a burning hatred from the man, wondering if he should strike him down right then as his hand gripped his sword hilt. Zhang demanded to know how long porters had been carrying swords and commanded him to hand the weapon over. Dan refused, and his deadly glare forced Zhang to back down, agreeing that they'd stop for the day since it was too late and training would begin tomorrow. Dan felt like too many people were eyeing his sword with greedy thoughts. The other porters cheered as Zhang gave in to the newcomer, and everyone went to sleep, but Zhang Chil stayed awake, plotting how to make Dan pay for that insult if he hadn't still had his sword. Late at night, while everyone slept, Zhang got up to find the newcomer, guessing he must be hiding somewhere close by. But he found Dan himself and asked if he wasn't sleeping. He then saw Dan standing still with his eyes closed, fast asleep. Zhang Chil lunged for the sword, but Dan snapped his eyes open and the poor porter froze instantly. Zhang Chil barely blinked before seeing his own death and feeling a fear so deep it made him feel like helpless prey standing before a hungry predator. He pleaded for forgiveness with all his heart. Dan shut his eyes again, quietly moving his inner strength around to keep himself safe. That habit of standing while he slept began when he spent so much time in the cave, always ready to fight. Even when he was sleeping, eating, or just relaxing, he never let his guard down. The next morning, Dan woke Zhang, only for her to scramble away in sheer terror. While the other porters woke up early to start work, they were amazed by Dan, who used the wind to lift and move heavy boxes with just his hands and feet. He was so strong and quick that he stacked the boxes like they weighed nothing at all. The porters warned him to be careful, but he kept hauling the heavy boxes himself, refusing to let them help. The young lady learned about it from a porter, and, while taking her break, she remembered what Dan had told her the day before. Perhaps she had upset him and wanted to say sorry, but instead of apologizing, she just thought it was strange. Her curiosity about those words kept her awake, so when he walked by, her face turned red. Dan mentioned he'd become a porter, and when she asked if he liked it, she realized that wasn't the question she wanted to ask, so she lost her nerve. Dan said he loved peace, but he hated the moment it was shattered. He also said that hearing a friend say sorry felt really bad. Co realized she was finally just a friend, so he calmly agreed and promised he'd never let her hear that again. Then Ping showed up, calling it a wonderful coincidence and remarking that Miss Zhou looked even more beautiful than he remembered from the last time he saw her. She wondered why he was there when he should be busy with Murim duties. He told them he'd gotten a new mission and that they'd pour everything they had into the escort agency, even though Dan just wanted peace while the Murim world spun dangerously close to a bloody whirlpool. At the same time, the Lord of the Celestial Watch heard the terrible news that 30 of his people had been wiped out. One survivor begged for forgiveness because he didn't know who had attacked, while the leader wondered if even the mighty Celestial Watch could have stopped the entire Black Tortoise unit of the Murim Alliance, especially since they were completely destroyed. Then, using his power, he made all the bodies float in the air and pulled the blood from them, declaring that they had all been defeated by one person. It had to be Jija or one of his monsters, but he wasn't sure if they could stop the blood demon. So he ordered his subordinate to hunt down everyone from the Murim Alliance at Hangan to find the one who destroyed his Celestial Watch force. Meanwhile, Sion watched as the flying dragons soared through the sky. Pang thought the woman was always breathtaking, yet he couldn't understand why she was with that bumpkin, especially since it was ridiculous for a porter to carry a sword. Sioen convinced Dan to ignore Pang's words, fearing that if the Flying Dragon Corporation was actually on the Alliance's side, any trouble they caused would hurt him. Pang wondered exactly how close they really were. Mirong, Pang's sister, guessed he'd rushed over when the leader gave the order just to act cool in front of her. Another man stepped up to ask if he was Dan and mentioned that Miss Joe's presence was a good thing before introducing himself as Helm Pio, an escort warrior sent by the leader to train the new porter. He had only just begun working before he was already off on a special mission. Pang said that was their job and saw it as a perfect chance to get closer to So Hyan. Dan asked what an escort mission was, admitting he didn't know, but he also refused to leave his sword behind. Pio told him not to worry and just to follow right behind him for the time being. The Flying Dragon Group had been counting on that poor guy getting fired. Mirong realized that even a high-ranking vice president could act like a kid when it came to women. But she realized that this Dan didn't even flinch when people tried to push his buttons. Han asked if he was really going now. Mirong figured that guy wasn't any big deal since he just gave in when teased. But Dan promised to stick with Pio because he couldn't get him fired. Pio recalled Sima's orders that Junch must train Dan to be a porter, but with a warning that Dan must not cause any trouble on the escort mission. Pio knew he had to make Dan back down before he got too close to CO Han, but he wondered why he even needed to help with that. Sima promised that he would get it when he finally met Dan. Pio thought his mountain past let him speak however he wanted, but seeing a porter walk around with a sword hanging out of its case was just too strange. He wondered if Dan had trained with a sword. Dan answered that he had mastered the art of the three energies. Pio believed he was a dreamer destined to be a warrior, saying the three energies sword was the foundation of many martial arts, even though he knew other ways worked much better. He swung his blade to show off his moves and asked Dan to go first and display what he knew with his three-energy sword. Dan asked if those were real fights and if Pio would actually try to kill him. Pio shook his head, saying it was only a duel to see who was stronger. Dan laughed and said he was too strong to need a fight to prove it. Pio questioned how he could say that when he had trained his entire life, while Dan was only a practitioner. Even so, he smiled and said he trusted his own strength and was ready to prove he could get even stronger. Then Dan lifted his arm to measure the distance and told his opponent this was the first time he wouldn't kill anyone with his sword, so he had to think very carefully about how to do it. After that, he stepped closer, checked exactly where to hit near Pio, and confirmed it was safe, meaning Pio would live. Pio guessed that was what the leader meant, since that man was truly strange. Before Pio even took a step, Dan had already seen his move and knew exactly what would happen. He moved out of the way just as the hit came down like a loud crash of thunder. Pio got cut because he thought the three-energy swords hadn't hit him. When Dan woke up a moment later, he asked the man if the fall had hurt him too much. Pio asked what style of fighting had been used. Dan explained that three-energy swords were the key to the heavenly thunder technique. Pio claimed the three energies looked nothing like the heavenly thunder he couldn't explain, and he never expected for that man to be a martial master, a secret even the agency leader didn't know, while Dan insisted that Pio's skills were actually the better ones. Pio found the idea ridiculous, yet his own skill made him so naive that he couldn't see it himself. Before he went to tell the leader, he first had to show Dan how the world really worked. He held out his hand, yet Dan just stood there and didn't move a muscle. Pio told us that reaching out a hand like that is just a friendly way to help someone stand back up. Then Dan gave him a hand to stand up. So Dan stayed at Pio's house, learning how things work there, and Pio was quite confused when he saw Dan sleeping with his feet on the ground. Pio was the one who helped Dan regain the skills he'd lost after spending years stuck inside the cave. He knows just how to write and read, exactly where to take off his clothes, and just as carefully where to leave them on. Because of this, Dan took a job carrying bags for Pio and slowly started to open his heart. Mirong kept a sharp eye on Dan, knowing the Flying Dragon had been sent just to watch over the Zhou clan. But then she saw the truth. Her only job was to watch that kid. Even though he acted strange, he looked so much like a silly show-off that it wasn't suspicious at all. But she saw that So Hun kept staring right at Dan. After a while, Dan became a true member of the Renat escort agency, and finally, the day of his super important mission arrived. Sima urged Mata, a seasoned veteran of the escort agency, to return safely on this vital mission, and he laughed off her worry, promising that the agency would see him back safe and sound. He marched at the front like a brave leader, while the carriages trailed behind with their helpers and warriors, marking the true start of Dan's new life in the civilized world. Just a few days before they headed out for their Zhou clan mission, Zhou Ilan was in his office welcoming guests from the Flying Dragon Corporation. Pang stepped forward to introduce himself, earning the leader's recognition as the legendary Sword Dragon, while the group's own introductions made him beam with delight. Zhou Ilhai felt the woman was so polite and beautiful that she was perfect for his son. He told us that while they live in his home, he hoped to teach his children martial arts through their daily interactions, knowing that young men and women naturally grow closer when they spend so much time together. It was a perfect chance for his son to shine. But Mirong wasn't looking there. Her gaze was fixed on something else entirely. She told her brother they had to finish their mission and asked why he was spending so much time watching the young lady even as she trained. She had been watching for days, yet Sei never looked at Pang and just stared at another random worker instead. Pang said not to worry, for they had asked to see the clan leader himself, showing just how important they were. While the escort agency team shared their final meal before setting off on their dangerous mission, Dan found cooked food absolutely delicious, especially since he had only been eating raw monsters before. P.O. claimed he'd never seen anyone eat like a magician performing a strange, wild ritual. Even so, he told them to eat well, because the mission ahead would be very hard, and they were heading to Sichuan, the Tong clan's home. This time, the request came from one of the most powerful clans in Jianghu. Just as the clients walked by, P.O. pointed out that even beyond the agency's escort warriors, the Tenglong group had brought their own guards, making it impossible to tell just how valuable the cargo they were carrying truly was. Dan held his gaze fixed on the old man. Hogwan complained that something smelled so good it was driving him crazy. Then he blew up a butterfly with just the power inside him. He told us that one of the hunters was giving off a strange energy, and it was definitely Dan. Just then, the chief guard Mayuki stepped up to say that everything was packed, and they could finally relax. Hagwan felt Mayuki was already sensing their power building up, so he suggested they head out soon because the road ahead would be a long one. Even so, the elder stayed wary, having no idea just how powerful Mayuki's energy really was. Mookie urged his escort warriors and porters to stop eating and listen, because the Renat team lived by speed and had to shave 4 months off the journey to Sichuan, forcing them to reach the destination in just 6 weeks. Everyone grew nervous and quickly replied, "Yes, sir," while Hayo warned Dan that falling behind Miyuki, the strict escort leader, would mean instant firing, so he had better keep up. Then everyone jumped up and rushed out, because Mookie was already getting ready to leave. Dan wondered what it felt like to fall behind, then watched as the horses, porters, and warriors all ran, knowing that Miyuki's missions were feared because of his strict ways. The real trouble was that not only the trained escort warriors had to keep up the pace, but also the untrained porters who were forced to run without any physical preparation, while Dan just strolled along as if he were on a simple walk. When bedtime rolled around, Mayuki asked if the boy wasn't going to sleep, and the boy replied, "Yes, sir. I sleep standing up." Dan and his escort group reached Pingding Mountain after 4 days of travel, only to be ambushed, where Miyuki instantly split a flying spear in half with his sword. It was a bunch of bandits. Hogwan called out that they were just forest bandits and told everyone not to panic, so they could wait and watch. Chell agreed, while P.O. said they'd pay the toll and leave if needed, reassuring Dan, who couldn't help wondering if these were the same bandits from before. Miyuki tossed chains of coins as toll and told them to clear the path, but the fat bald man sliced the cords, claiming he didn't want small change and only the goods. He then jumped straight at Miyuki, attacking her with sudden, fierce force. That bandit didn't come for the goods. He came to kill. Miyuki blocked the first hit, but the second blow to his chest made him cough up blood. The fat bald man sneered at the escort agency, ordering his men to kill everyone before the bandits charged straight at the porters. Junch froze in terror, just like everyone else. Hogwan asked who was behind those bandits, since they were clearly not just ordinary forest thieves. The bald man told them they were the Green Forest Bandits' heroes and said it was an honor to die at their hands. Hogwan said it was a real shame, because if they were just bandits, they could have lived a full life. He shot a poison needle that punched through the first bandit's chest and blew him apart, then kept firing until several more bandits were pierced along the way. And then, the ones who pulled the strings finally stepped out from the shadows. It turned out the forest bandits were hired by people from the Phantom Hall. The first one declared that since Tang Hogwan of the Tang clan had stepped in, there would be no idle talk, for the Phantom Hall had issued a deadly order. Everyone there would die. Hogwan urged everyone to get ready, warning that their rivals were serious, and insisted that even if every escort from the agency fell, they still had to get those items to the main clan. He urgently told the elite guards to protect their precious cargo at all costs, even as the ruthless Phantom Hall assassins instantly slaughtered several porters and warriors. Dan just stood there in the middle of the battlefield, watching everything happen. Mayuk knew his escort warriors couldn't stand a chance against those assassins, the true masters. So even though the Tang clan had the upper hand, they refused to draw their swords to help them. But when Dan finally stood face to face with the very person who had been helping him, he pulled his sword and struck with such speed that the assassin was instantly crushed. Everyone else just stood there, wondering what that big bang was all about. Pio shouted at Dan to quicken his pace and lend a hand to the others. Dan asked why, and explained that he'd only helped because that one person was his friend. Pio explained that everyone was part of the rescue mission and begged him to help the others as well. Mayuk was badly hurt. The assassin who had already knocked out Young Chil was still a threat, and even though Dan didn't quite get what Pio meant, he promised to help anyway. Only Hagwon could dimly track where Dan was moving, while the assassins left in the dark. In just a few seconds, and with only a few steps, Dan walked straight through the Phantom Hall assassins and turned them into ash with his lightning. Wan Hei, the head of Phantom Hall, was shocked to find her organization completely destroyed, since she only expected to handle a simple escort job. One of her subordinates apologized, admitting they had failed to spot the incredibly powerful martial artist standing there. She answered that she'd take care of it herself and track down that powerful master, for even though the woman clan wasn't one of the top 5, it ran a third of the trade and held so much money that no one could ignore it. Word got out to Wuan Wang, the head of the woman clan, but the Tang clan had secretly joined forces with the W clan to build deadly thunder bombs and were now hauling away 5 full carriages of them. Wang asked if they were saying they had finally found the secret recipe for thunder bombs, which had vanished hundreds of years ago along with the Thunder Sect. The subordinate said the clan came from the Thunder Sect and had finally brought their secret power back to the world. Hang said that the reports showed those bombs could silently wipe out ordinary groups, so they needed both the weapons and the way to make them. The messenger admitted that the young lady had figured out the truth and vanished away with the Phantom Hall. Huang questioned Hai about what she had done and where she had gone. The messenger said she had started the journey toward Ping Mountain. Hai was so eager, stepping closer to that intriguing man. While the other ships were busy putting the sailors who had died to rest, the rest of the group kept moving forward. Thanks to Dan's help, the agency wiped out their enemies but lost almost all their warriors, leaving only the badly wounded Mayuk alive. The other porters were so scared they could barely move. Shelji warned that under those conditions, the escort mission would struggle to go on, so they needed to turn back. Hagwon shook his head and said, no, they'd bring it all the way through, while she pressed him, asking if he really meant to keep that agency under those conditions, or if he'd rather find a new one. Then he spoke of the heavenly thunder. Hagwon asked what he meant, and Hagwon even congratulated Chelly on mastering Kang's secret art, wishing only that Chelly had warned them sooner. Chelly said he could barely see it, so Coley knew he couldn't either, but he insisted it wasn't him using the heavenly thunder and guessed it was that kid over there instead. Hagwon stepped up and asked which sect Dan came from and who taught him those skills. Dan believed Cha had never taught the martial arts, but had only thrown them into that hell. The fighting skills he possessed were his own, forged through countless battles on the razor's edge between life and death. He had learned nothing from any school, so he told the elder that he had no teacher. Hagwon asked if those powers just dropped from the sky and if he was being rude to him. Pio saw what was happening and stepped in to explain that his friend had lived in the mountain caves for years, so he acted that way and asked the elder to forgive him this time. Hagwon thought Porter looked a bit arrogant, but since his strength would help finish the mission, that didn't matter much, especially since Porter seemed to be listening to the escort warrior, just as he should. Pio told Dan to stop talking like that. Hagwon admitted Dan was far more skilled than he thought and would take the leader's spot, so with someone who could wield lightning guiding the escort, they would be safe no matter what happened. Pio asked if he would step up to be the one in charge. Mayuki agreed that Dan was all they had and promised to dash back to the agency for more help while Dan took the lead. Pio felt that someone needed to step up and take the blame. So he nodded and said, yes, sir, admitting he had much more to learn but promising to lead the escort. Hagwon promised to rest until tomorrow before they left, saying they wouldn't move any further today. But Chelly couldn't stop thinking that none of it made any sense. Though he was just a new porter, he had become a master of the powerful heavenly thunder. With Pio leading the way, the Reen agency pressed on. Meanwhile, Miyuki rushed back to the Reen escort agency to report the attack right away. But on his way, a weapon swung from a chain caught him and ended his life instantly. The Blood Demon's elite hit squad, the Phantom Assassins, had finally shown up. They had to wipe out everyone at the Zhou clan house right away, while the clan leader sat with Sima, shuffling through papers as she wondered why he wasn't taking a break. Zhou Ilian said they had to rush the work and training because waiting too long would make them too lazy to want to finish it. Suddenly, he sensed a deadly threat, and soon the clan courtyard filled with the cries of the dying. They didn't realize they were facing enemies because the assassins were so good at hiding and the Blood Demon group meant to kill anyone who tried to leave. Sima drew his sword and shouted, asking how those crazy fools dared to attack the Zhou clan. Zhou Ilian ordered him to leave because he sensed a dangerous and unnatural urge to kill that even he couldn't handle alone. The assassins kept killing the people, leaving the Zhou warriors with no way to fight back. The Blood Demon killers commanded that every single person, even the escorts, be put to death. Soon, Sima grabbed the young lady's arm, and they hurried away from the place to get out alive. He urged her to keep moving since they had to go, but she refused, saying her father was still there. He questioned if she had forgotten that her father was the legendary Zhou clan leader, the strongest spear of Henan who ruled the region alone. Yet even knowing he was a mighty man, the assassins refused to run away. Sima said she didn't realize her father was holding off the killers to save her and her brother. Zhou nodded in agreement, saying they had to do this for their dad. Sima told them they needed to hide for the moment, apologized, and asked if the Flying Dragon group could come along with them. Murim said they'd head back to the Murim Alliance right this second. Pang challenged her to listen closely, but she insisted he must understand that they had to report the attack immediately. The other warrior nodded, warning that the assassins would strike any second and that they couldn't leave Sima to guard the young masters alone. Sima figured that if they couldn't get help, their only hope was Porter, the man who had already wiped out the forest bandits. He promised they'd find other ways out and beg for their safety. After the Flying Dragon group took off, Sima told Saihan they had to keep moving and suggested heading toward the escort group that had gone to Sichuan. Sioan believed that heading straight for Dan was their only chance to fight, so she decided her father had to stay safe until then. After a long fight with assassins, the clan leader stood strong despite being badly hurt and asked who they were and why they were attacking the Zhou clan estate. Then the assassin leader appeared in the distance, asking if he wanted to know why before he died. Right before he died, Ilian asked me how he was still breathing. Then the Blood Demon blew his head apart, shouting that he had already thrown away the name he was about to speak. As the sun rose, the Blood Demon stared at the pile of ashes that used to be the Zhou clan estate and nodded, saying the job was done perfectly. One of them said that the others were hunting down the last members of the Zhou clan, but he wondered why they should kill them all. The Blood Demon claimed that to regain his strength, he had to crush that estate underfoot. He asked the assassin if he knew about his fight with Giza, and after the assassin and the Blood Demon confirmed they were the only ones left, he realized the 100 masters in the Zhou clan estate were the final piece Giza needed, so he had to destroy that last hope before it could grow. Sima saw the assassins closing in, so they had to keep running until they could reach the mission group, but the young master was too far behind, and soon Join was stabbed in the chest and dragged away by the attackers. Suddenly, one of them charged straight at Sei Ho Yen. The horses toppled over one another, and Sima stepped forward to shield the girl. Sioan wondered if her father had already fallen, especially since they had come this far. Just as one assassin lunged to slash her throat, a bolt of lightning struck, instantly shattering the sword and killing the killer. Dan was the one who heard the young lady's cry and stepped in to fix things. While coming back with the porters and P.O., Dan heard something, promised he'd be right back, and split from the escort mission. Then he vanished right before her eyes, but Dan knew for sure he had heard her voice and her cry. That was his reason for smashing the sword and taking down the assassin. Sima asked him to look after C.O. Hyan for her, since that was all she needed. The Blood Demons didn't care about the boy at all and would have sliced him to pieces just because he stood in their path. Dan placed his hand on Siosan's forehead, and instantly, the heavy fear and tiredness that had been weighing her down just vanished. He asked her to stop crying and reminded her that everything would be finished very soon. He spun around and unleashed a sky attack, sending lightning bolts crashing down on the assassins. They were all zapped to death by the electricity. Sio wondered if nearly 20 assassins had turned to ash in a split second, and if she had even a tiny bit of his power, maybe she wouldn't need anyone else to protect her. She buried her loved ones, promising they could rest in peace while she returned soon. Then she turned to Dan, asking what she should do now and how she could live on her own without her dad or her brother. Dan was left all by himself. He had clawed his way through that nightmare all alone and finally stepped back into this world. The first person to reach out his hand was that girl, so he stayed for her too, telling her to live with gratitude for those who came before her to live doing what was right and what she wanted. She answered that she wanted to go on the mission with him and stay by his side. Dan took her arm and promised they'd go together, begging her not to let go. Then he jumped over the trees with her, soaring through the air in a way that felt like flying rather than just fighting. While they rushed through the trees, Dan's actions made her feel better than any words ever could. She marveled at her uncle's legendary strength, wondering how the assassins could have defeated him when he was barely older than them. He said that fighting to stay alive for so long had changed a person like that. She wanted to know who he had fought, so he told her about the monsters and demons he battled. She leaned in and begged him to share the rest of the story. Thinking only about that hell, Dan kept his mouth shut because talking would mean admitting he crawled up over the 99 dead bodies of his friends to reach Gianna, only to find the bastard already dead and his revenge gone forever. He promised to tell the tale, but not just yet. Dan escorted Se Ho Yin back to Himio, where she finally stood face to face with the last survivor of the escort agency. Dan and Josel sprinted back to the Renat escort agency, only to find it completely gone, leaving Heo utterly baffled as he wondered how the whole place could have just vanished. The porters grew worried and started wondering what they were supposed to do next. Many started wondering if they'd have to find a new place to live and work, and Jose Yun apologized for delivering such bad news right in the middle of their mission. But Hunjio said it was okay because she was likely the one taking the biggest hit from all of this. Even so, he saw that the group's spirit, already broken after the last attack, had vanished completely upon hearing the news, leaving them unsure if they could even finish their escort mission. But then he tried to lift their spirits by reminding them of the huge commission they had promised for the mission, enough to let everyone start their lives over in a simple way, perhaps even rebuilding the Renat escort agency itself. Hearing that, Jose realized she had to stop drowning in her grief, stand up like Dan Hyen who to avenge her father, and protect the living members of the Zhou clan before Dan Hainu urged them to keep moving on their escort mission. Ilan Zhou asked his uncle if the woman wasn't the leader of the Zhou clan, but his uncle just told him to leave it alone and focus on the mission. Deep inside, he was still stunned by the mysterious porters vanishing, yet he figured that as long as that man stayed on the job, it didn't matter if the caravan was carrying a woman, a tiger, or anything else at all. The group hurried on, eager to finish everything as fast as they could. While on the trip, Zhou Yun felt curious about what Dan Heian had said earlier, noting that Dan had been battling monsters for so long, yet she had never heard of such a place. She didn't truly get what was going on with him, so she asked him to explain his words again before he said them. Instead of answering, Dan Hyen, who had just asked if Chanzhou was truly dead, spoke up. She said everyone had been talking about this since he was supposedly dead 10 years ago. Even so, Dan Hyen, who couldn't shake the feeling that he'd never get his revenge, and he honestly didn't believe Chang'e was really dead, so he asked why everyone suspected something and if there was any proof. At that moment, Hyong Pio explained that strange things surrounded Chanjija's rumored death, since while rumors usually start somewhere, nobody knew where this one began, yet the whole world still believed he was dead just because he vanished. It felt like someone on purpose was spreading the word around Django to convince everyone that Django was really dead. Jose asked if someone had made up the rumor on purpose, but he wondered why anyone would do that. Honio explained that he had no solid proof yet, but he suspected Chunjija might have been the one to spread the rumor about his own death. But before Dan Hyen, who could finish thinking about it, Peng Chelong shouted for everyone to stop. Right in the middle of the road, a broken carriage lay in ruins. One of the men apologized for the trouble and said they probably couldn't fix it, then asked if he could take the young lady along with the caravan to the next village. Right then, Peng Cho-yong saw the symbol on the carriage. The fact that they were from the one clan made him immediately suspicious, especially since their recent attacks had likely already leaked the cargo's secret, making this convenient carriage breakdown feel too much like a trap. Then the young lady finally showed up, and it was one Hai. Her stunning beauty made everyone else spellbound, but Dan Hyen just didn't notice. As she leaped from the carriage and walked toward them, the men were so captivated that even Pinkoli paused for a moment just to look at her, while Wuan Hai climbed lightly onto the cargo wagon like a butterfly landing and sat down. Right away, Jose told her not to step into the wagon with the goods, and Hyong Pio instantly agreed that it made no sense, while Dan Hyonggu just didn't care at all. Meanwhile, Peng Exkayong finally agreed to ride with them in the wreckage of her carriage until they reached the next village. Hearing that, even Hyong Pio thought the old man had been charmed by her. One Hai thanked them politely, even though the porters were already drooling over her, while only Hing Pio and Dan Hon will look completely unaffected. Ping Cheong still asked why she would stay in the dirty cargo wagon instead of riding in a nicer one. She calmly said she was getting enough help and could make it on her own, so the caravan kept moving. At the same time, Woman Hai quietly started talking to her men using voice messages. She said it was lucky the old man agreed so easily. Then she studied the whole crowd and saw there was just one escort warrior standing among about 30 porters. Except for Pang Kaliong, she couldn't spot any real master among those marshals. That looked way too weird for an escort pulling 5 wagons loaded with thunder bombs. The Thunder sect made thunder bombs, fiery bombs that could wipe out whole groups and leave no sign they were ever there. Once their powerful weapons were made, the sect became far more powerful, but those same weapons ended up bringing about their downfall. Afterward, The Thunder sect vanished for hundreds of years, leaving no trace at all. But now, the way to make these bombs had come back to the world all over again. Wuanhai also found out that the Ghost Pavilion had been destroyed by that group. At first she thought they'd used thunder bombs, but since no one was there, she noticed a porter carrying a sword and realized that must be how the attack had been stopped. Even though he didn't look like a fighter, he suddenly caught her eye for some reason. But the weirdest thing wasn't even that. From the second she walked in, that guy never even glanced her way. That hit her pride right in the middle, making her wonder if any man could truly ignore her beauty. So, she called out to Dan Hyen, who turned to her as he usually would. But the moment her eyes locked with his icy stare, she froze without thinking. For the very first time, a man stared at her with total indifference, his eyes showing no spark of desire, no hint of fascination, and no trace of admiration. At that moment, Wuanhai made up her mind that she would never let anyone humiliate her, no matter who he was, and she would force that man to kneel before her. After running all day, they finally stopped to rest and finish their mission, but just as Dan stayed near the forest entrance and Jose brought him food, Wuhi rushed past her before she could reach him. She stepped up to Dan Hyen, who leaned in to whisper that she could give him anything he wanted if he followed her into the dark woods and never once looked back. She knew he had a sword, so she guessed he liked fighting. Because of that, she planned to draw him in by using the secret tricks of the Woman Clan. She secretly wondered if he could really keep up with her. But suddenly, Dan Hyen, who stepped right in front of her, having arrived before her. Startled, Wuanhai let out a scream that sent her men running into the woods. But she couldn't believe a simple porter had beaten her there and demanded to know who he really was. He quietly told them his name was Dan Hyen, but he didn't care about that. All he wanted to know was where Chunjija was. He urged her to hand over the information fast, or his meat soup would turn cold. Wuanhai said she didn't know where Chiana was, so Dan Honu replied that since she didn't have what he wanted, he would leave, but then Wuanhai told him she still had a few questions to ask. But right then, her men rushed forward, their faces full of anger at what they saw. They shouted for answers about what that little porter had done to Miss Wuan and reached for their swords before she could speak. Before anyone could blink, Dan Hyen vanished right in front of them. In that split second, Wuanhai understood he wasn't just using a move. He had truly disappeared from sight. Moments later, a strong gust of wind snatched the bowl right out of Josie's hands. Actually, it was Dan Hyen who took it, looking calm as he tasted the soup, and said he was glad it hadn't gone cold. Zhou Xiaolan was so shocked he couldn't believe it, and immediately asked if he had ever been with Wenhe. She remarked that the young lady was stunningly beautiful. Dan Hyen, who smiled calmly, and told her she was beautiful, adding that she could easily win the heart of any man she chose. Then Zhou Seljan asked if she thought she was beautiful too. He nodded and said she was just as beautiful as Zhou Xiaolan, then quickly added that he hated beautiful women because their charm always led to death. While in the forest, one of Wuanhai's guards muttered that he now knew Dan Hyen was the one who destroyed the terrifying ghost hall. Even so, Wuanhai said she had to watch him a bit longer since, apart from his name, she knew nothing else about him. By the next morning, before anyone even noticed, the Renat escort was almost at its goal in Sichuan, and Josian couldn't stop thinking about what Dan Hyen had said the night before, wondering what kind of life he'd lived to believe that a beautiful woman's allure always led to death. That's when Hyang Pio showed up and told everyone to stay on their toes from then on. He knew deep down that as they drew closer to their destination, the air grew weirder and more ominous. And since his gut feeling for danger was almost always right, he couldn't shake the chill creeping up his spine. Ping Cholong and Ilhai Zhou felt exactly the same thing. Pang Koliong figured they'd make it there by tomorrow, so if anything bad was still coming, it had to be the Black Viper sect. Over the past decade, the sect swelled into the sole power in Sichuan strong enough to challenge the Tang clan, leading Pangshe Olyuang to grow suspicious that secrets about the mission had leaked from within their own ranks. Shortly after, Jocelyn warned Dan Hyen about a possible ambush, but Dan calmly replied that he already knew and even said there were around 100 of them. Just then, Wuhi froze in shock, wondering if he could really feel people nearby and even count how many were hiding, which suddenly felt completely ridiculous. Just a moment later, dozens of warriors popped up from everywhere and surrounded the caravan escort. Dan Hyen instantly saw that just 50 of them had shown up first. Just as he was about to move, Pang Shou Yong ordered him to stay and guard the cargo, then vowed that the trash from the Black Viper sect would fall by his sword. Immediately after, the old man lunged ahead and unleashed a fierce hail of poisoned needles against his foes. As the fight raged on, Hyang Pio turned to Dan Hyen, and worriedly asked if they would truly make it through. But he just told him not to worry, saying the old man would win. He stepped up and the Tang family took on the fight against the Black Viper warriors themselves. Even though the sect had grown huge over the last decade, it meant nothing against true experts, especially with Ili Zhou and Pankale Yang standing there. Even then, several hidden watchers couldn't hide their unease as Wanhai realized they'd vastly underestimated the Sichuan Tang clan, who were wiping out 50 men with terrifying ease. One of her guards admitted that even if 50 more Black Viper warriors showed up, they still couldn't win, so Wanhai decided the smartest move was to pull back for now. The trouble was she couldn't make her move without causing a scene, but right then Dan Haiyanhu quietly told her that if she wanted to walk away, he wouldn't stop her. In an instant, a guard realized with horror that they had just overheard their entire private conversation. Then Dan Haiyan warned them with ice-cold eyes that if they didn't run away right now, he would kill everyone there. Wanhai saw right through the bluff, so she snapped orders for Yung Chil to send a retreat message immediately. Later, she told Dan Hai and who that thanks to him, her warriors would no longer have to die in that place. But Dan Haiyanhu let them go not because of the ambush, but because a terrifying rage had been gnawing at his nerves all along. At the same time, Pang Kaoling was casually crushing the warriors of the Black Viper sect. While the Tang clan warriors celebrated their victory, an unseen assassin watched from the shadows, knowing that the real attack by the Crimson Moon Troop was about to strike while they were relaxed and vulnerable. Dan Hanu pretended not to notice the others running away, letting the 50 men slip past him and escape alive. Even then, he could still feel the sick feeling of a killer's intent hanging all around him. That night, the group stopped to make camp once more. While getting ready, Hunjio asked if Miss Zhou Selian could sleep in Miss Wanhai's tent next to the carriage, but Zhou Sun said it was fine for her to sleep with everyone else. She started realizing that she had never truly understood the escort agency, because everything used to feel so calm and peaceful that moving goods always seemed like simple work. After joining that mission, she finally saw the truth. Those escort warriors and porters were always risking their lives to keep others safe. That was her choice. As part of the Renat escort agency, she would sleep right next to them. And on top of that, she made another bold choice. She would become a true leader of the escort, not just because she was the clan's only young lady. Right then, Dan Haiyanhu popped up and explained that working in the escort agency actually started out as a porter. Haiyang Pio nodded, admitting he wasn't technically wrong. Then Zhou Xiaolan begged them to show her how to become an elite porter. Hearing that made Hunjio feel so proud of how much Zhou the young lady had grown. At the same time, it was revealed that the Crimson Moon Troop was a secret group of killers built by the Black Viper sect. They became masters of surprise attacks, silent killings, and vanishing into thin air thanks to their strange methods. Right then, Dan Haiyanhu walked all by himself through the woods, hunting for the deadly vibe he could still feel. Deep in the shadows, an assassin from the Crimson Moon signaled his team to get ready for the ambush. But right then, Dan Haiyanhu spotted them and coldly told them he knew they were hiding there. While the escort group slept soundly, the assassins got ready to strike. Just as they were about to act, Dan Haiyanhu burst forward so quickly it seemed like he vanished and reappeared instantly. Without making a sound, he stepped up to an assassin and ended him in an instant, only for the next one to fall before even getting a chance to move. Two of them had already vanished without a whisper. Finally, the assassin leader roared out his signal to strike, ordering everyone to rush in and make sure no one survived. He hurried right up to Pang Cho-long and insisted that the old man had fought hard to bring the thunder bombs all the way there. In the end, the Black Viper sect will be the ones to take them. Just as he was about to strike, a broken sword slammed into his path and stopped him in his tracks. Dan Haiyanhu's sword made the assassin leader furious, and he demanded to know what his Crimson Moon allies were doing while a sentry was still alive. The other scouts were stunned, too, since they hadn't felt a thing until that very second. The leaders suddenly realized the terrifying truth. Dan Haiyanhu had been listening to every single word they said. Then Dan Haiyanhu quietly asked if their group was truly called the Crimson Moon. Dan Haiyanhu told the horrified assassin leader that his Crimson Moon troop was gone and he was the only one left, so he cut off the leader's head instantly, joking that he'd be happy to keep him company in death. When Island Joe opened his eyes, he rushed to tell his uncle that the whole forest was packed with dead assassins. Joss asked what went wrong, and Haiyang Pio explained that they'd been caught off guard by a sudden attack. Even so, every porter walked away safe while all the enemies fell. It all came down to Dan Haiyan, who showing up just in time to shield the group once more. Wu-He realized once again that he had saved everyone, but she still couldn't figure out the man because he seemed like an unreadable puzzle to her now. Thanks to his help, the escort group finally got out of the mess. With no one left to threaten them on the road, they kept traveling until they reached Sichuan province, where the porters immediately went drinking and relaxing after their long journey. But Ilhai and Zhou felt uneasy about Wenyi's presence and asked if she hadn't said she needed to stop somewhere else before Chengdu, since they were practically there already. She told him not to worry, promising she would leave on her own when the time was right, while Hyang Pio warned Dan Huanhu that once they reached the Tang clan, they'd be too busy to stop and ask why. Hyang Pio confessed he wasn't much of a joker, then explained that the Ackland lived near the Sichuan Tang clan because he'd mentioned a friend from there, which made Dan Hyun instantly recall Saji A.K., the friend who had once asked him to find his family someday. He gave the word that they had to head straight to Ackland right now. Once the Tang clan warmly welcomed everyone after the cargo was safely delivered, paying Choyong handed over the escort payment and added extra money to make up for everything they had suffered on the mission. He also said he would rely on Zhou Su-yong from then on and joked that maybe it was time to start calling her leader. For Jocelyn, that single moment meant everything. She had lost her clan, her home, and everything she owned. Now, as the boss of the Renat escort agency, she got her first real paycheck and felt like she was finally putting her life back together. Hung Pio gently put her fears at ease, promising that brighter days were coming. Jose said yes with a grateful heart, thanking everyone who had stayed by her side. Wan Hai, who had walked all the way with us to the Tang clan, told her men to stop caring about the thunder bombs. She knew that since the weapons were being made again, the main clan would soon find out the truth and could no longer be fooled. She said the woman clan never wanted something they couldn't get. No matter the obstacle, they always managed to get what they wanted, but right then she didn't care about the bombs. All she truly wanted was Dan Haiyan-hu. Once Dan Haiyan-hu reached the Tang clan, he found that even those he had saved in the past now looked at him with new respect. But Dan Haiyan-hu had only one thing on his mind. Wan Huang personally invited the group to rest within the Tang clan for a while. But Dan Haiyan-hu instantly agreed and then leaped away with a huge jump. Standing on top of one of the tallest buildings, he started looking for an energy flow just like the Seiji axe. After a while, he felt something far away pulling at him, and even though it was just a flicker of hope, he knew that was all he had left, so he chose to follow it. Later, Jocelyn asked where they were going, but Hyang Pio said he'd explain it all once they got back since he wasn't even sure himself what was happening. Then, Dan Haiyan-hu gave her a gentle pat on the head, pouring a bit of his own strength into her to calm her, while silently vowing to come back. As the group left, Hyang Pio spotted someone watching them from behind. Peering closer, he saw his One Hai, probably chasing Dan Hai through Hu all over again. So he carefully slowed to watch the chase, but then Dan He-hu shared some of his power with him, making him feel as light as a feather and sending him speeding forward. Wan Hai froze, stunned to see a warrior who was never known for speed suddenly move with absurd velocity. Late that night, they finally stumbled into the AK clan's headquarters on the outskirts of Chengdu. Hyang Pio agreed they could go in once everything was ready, but he was instantly worried because there were no guards watching over the place. He tapped the gate. The man who stepped forward looked just like, say, Dan Haiyan-hu's friend, but the guard didn't recognize them and said the clan wasn't taking guests, so Hyang Pio asked if anyone knew who Say AK was. The guard's face went pale the second he heard that name, and he immediately shouted to find out who was hunting for Seiji. In an instant, Hyang Pio was overwhelmed by a crushing wave of killing intent from the man, so heavy it made it hard to breathe. Then, Dan Hengu stepped forward, unleashed his energy, and completely smashed the guard's pressure. That made the man so angry he drew his sword and was ready to strike instantly. But Henpio tried to calm things down, saying it must just be a mix-up and that Dan Haiyan was actually Sayak's friend. He couldn't believe it, so he asked how that was even possible. Then, Dan Haiyan-hu stepped forward and told everyone who he was. Feeling the heavy tension in the air, Hyang Pio quickly apologized for his manners, admitting that living so long alone in the mountains had left him clueless about proper etiquette. Then the man called himself Wang A, explained that Sayak was his missing nephew from 10 years back, and immediately demanded to know if Dan Haiyan-hu had ever met Say and where he was. Hearing that, Dan Haiyan-hu started putting all the clues together. Rumors said Chengija had passed and Sayak vanished 10 years ago, but to him, the hell they endured felt like a century, even though only a decade had truly gone by in the real world. Then Wang Gak pressed for an answer again. And right then, Dan Han-hu spoke the hard truth. Sayak was gone. The news sent Wang completely over the edge. Enraged, he lunged with his sword at Dan Han-hu, yet Dan didn't even try to dodge. Seeing that, Wu Hai flew into a rage and charged to help, only to be grabbed and held back by him, who snapped that she wasn't needed. Then everyone saw that Wang Ok's sword had not even touched Dan Haiyan, whose body was wrapped in a powerful energy field that blocked the attack, and Wang Yak hesitated, wondering if Dan Hainu's silence meant he was truly Seiji's friend. Suddenly, an older man named Baiwen, A.K., stepped forward to ask what was happening and scold Wangkok for his angry outburst, then demanded to know why he was attacking the guests, revealing himself as Sei-A's father and the leader of the Aklan. Wang quickly apologized while Dan Haiyan, who stared silently at the man who was his friend's father. Then he repeated the terrible news. Sei-A was dead, and even though Baiwen A was shaken, he admitted he had already expected this deep down. He apologized for keeping the guests waiting so long, and then invited them into the clan. Meanwhile, Josian waited for Dan Han Hu and Hyong Po to come back, trying to figure out exactly what he had done to her when he sent his energy into her before he left. Just as she was thinking, the sound of shouting from the tavern cut her thoughts short. A man screamed that he'd finally found his mark and wondered if he had been hiding there the whole time. Suddenly, someone was flung violently into the tavern. The agency's porters were so scared they froze in place. They had just sat down to rest and drink after the mission, but suddenly they were thrown right into the middle of a bloody fight. Seeing the danger, Zhou Xiaolan shouted for everyone to rush inside and hide right away. Since neither Hyo nor Dan Hyunho was around, anything could go wrong, but she thought their attackers weren't aiming at them. Even so, the scene was absurd as two young swordsmen from the Black Viper sect committed murder right in the middle of a crowded tavern. One of the men who kept fighting made them back down by asking if they really thought they could get away with it, since the Tang clan would never let this slide. While everyone else stood back, one of the Black Viper kids just laughed at them and called them all cowards. Josian looked closer and saw it was the very gang that had tried to rob them before. One of the Black Viper men told us that their boss had given them a chance to give up, but since they chose to stand by the Tang clan, they knew they would all die right there. Then the tavern turned into a scene of pure carnage. As the killing went on, a young man walked up to Josian with a nasty grin and asked why a flower like her was in such a terrible place. The others burst into laughter, mocking Young Chil for finding another girl to add to his collection without a hint of fear, until Josie shouted for them to get out of the way. One of the men reached for her shoulder to ask about the Black Viper sect, but the moment he spoke, June seized his arm, twisted it behind his back with crushing force, snapped the bone, and slammed him to the ground. Seeing that, one of the veterans chuckled and added that every flower has its thorns. Then he leaned in and asked just who she really was. Then she introduced herself as Josei Hullen, the eldest daughter of the Zhou clan and the head of the Renat escort agency. The men standing behind her couldn't help but laugh and shake their heads, insisting it had to be a joke since no one could possibly miss recognizing such a stunning young woman. The veteran spoke up, saying they deserved better treatment, even though his face stayed hard. Zhou Shan knew she couldn't fight them all by herself, so she grabbed her key and blasted out of the tavern at top speed. She didn't want to pull the porters into the fight. As she sprinted through the streets, unsure if she'd survive, it all felt maddeningly hopeless since their strongest warrior was gone, leaving the young leader alone in the chaos. Meanwhile, far away from there, the air felt totally different. The AK clan sipped tea in peaceful silence as their hosts welcomed them warmly. While they were talking, Baiwen AK mentioned that it would have been 20 if he were still alive, then asked if he and Dan Haiyanhu were the same age. Dan Haiyanhu bowed and said they were, right before Hyangio spotted something silly. If Dan Haiyanhu were only 20, he'd still be twice as old as that boy. Baiwen AK then pressed C for the exact details of his death. Suddenly, the air grew thick and heavy. Then, Dan Haiyanhu shared that C had stood by him as both a loyal friend and a trusted companion. Back in that hell, the two survivors made a promise. Whoever lived would go find the family of the one who didn't. According to him, she often worried he might not survive, but Dan Haiyan always replied that they would live through it together and visit their fallen friend's family side by side. Before he passed, C asked Dan Hyo to tell his father all the truth and say sorry for him if he didn't make it. Dan Haiyanhu confessed that Sei had given his own life so he could survive, and after Baiwen AK stood silent for a moment, he declared that his son dying to save a friend was a truly noble end. He said that the last time he truly saw Seiji was when he was just a little kid. As he gazed at Dan Hyeongo, he knew this child had survived horrors just as terrible. That realization made the Aklan leader's heart ache. From that day on, Baiwen AK declared that Dan Hyeonhu would be his son, and Dan could finally call him father. They all thought Dan Hyeonhu would never reply. The boy always felt like a wall of ice, keeping everyone at arm's length. Even Wani felt he might just brush off the offer or swing his sword at someone before even replying. To everyone's shock, Dan Haeon calmly replied, "Yes, father," which made B1A laugh with pride at having expected nothing less from Sage's friend. He said that his son's spirit had finally returned home after 10 years of absence. A moment of such profound joy, he ordered drinks to celebrate the return. Once the AKC clan leader gave the order, the heavy mood lifted and everyone felt much lighter. While they talked, Wang A wound up sharing the whole story of the clan with Hyang Pio. 10 years ago, before C vanished, the Aklan was just an ordinary group from Sichuan with no fame. But after the tragedy, Baiwen A threw away everything to hunt for his son until a master showed up and taught him the legendary martial arts of Chanjija. After that, Baiwen AK threw himself into mastering the moon-destroying blade, letting the pain of losing his son burn like fuel to drive his training. This is how he built the AK clan's current reputation. Wangak also said that lately, a new group has started eating up several martial groups across Sichuan, no matter how big or powerful they were. Finally, the fight came to the Aklan who were getting ready for a final showdown. So he apologized again, saying he had thought Dan Heonhu and his friends were actually part of the Black Viper group. After hearing that, Wonhai and Hyang Pio started to think this was the same group that had attacked the escort mission earlier. While everyone else chatted away, Baiwen AK grew worried to see Dan Hyen Hu chugging straight from the jar without a break. The challenge was easy. He'd never touched a drink, yet from far away, Dan Hyen Hu caught the sound of voices. It was the group of people hunting down Zhou Xiaolon. Right away, he stood up and promised his new dad he'd be right back. Before anyone could move, he vanished in a flash of his special movement skills. Just then, the Black Viper gang finally caught up to Zhou Xiaolon. They circled her, laughing and asking if that was all she had left as the boss of the escort agency. Suddenly, a man lunged to strike her, but just as his hand was about to land on Zhou Xiaolon, a burst of power slammed him back, leaving him screaming in confusion. In that very moment, Josian finally understood that when Dan Han placed his palm on her head, he had planted a shield of energy deep within her to protect her. Only then did those treacherous Black Vipers finally drop their guard and pull out their blades. Zhou had no weapons now, and she knew her fighting skills alone couldn't beat them all. Even so, she chose to face her death there rather than run away like a coward. But just as she was about to act, Dan Hainu showed up right on time. He snatched the sword from the first man who tried to attack Josian and smashed the blade into thousands of tiny pieces. Right after that, a sudden electric shock hit the man hard and knocked him to the ground. Dan Heonhu asked her what she was up to and wondered if she really meant to fight all of them like that. Join finally saw that her mind had been foggy all along. It was the weirdest thing of all that the second she thought of him, he just showed up, and Dan Heonhu asked if she'd been about to die, wondering if that was the only reason he appeared. Meanwhile, a group of Black Viper members leaned in to whisper that they thought they could finally catch the girl now that her protective shield was gone. Then they stared at Dan Heonhu and asked if he was the scoundrel behind all of it. Dan Heonhu quickly grasped the situation, but first warned Zhou Yin never to be so careless again, only for the Black Viper men to step in and taunt him about whether he was truly afraid of their powerful organization. At that exact moment, Josian saw pure fury on Dan Han's face for the very first time. He quickly flipped his sword over and cut the earth right in front of him, making sure to miss the enemies entirely. The strike shot up massive stone spikes that stabbed straight through the cowardly Black Viper members. Josian was frozen in fear, completely lost, and unable to make sense of the chaos around them. The ground shook so hard it felt like it was chasing the enemies. Then, a huge earth dragon rose up and swallowed the Black Viper veteran. Dan Hyen told Josian that the earth dragon was the second form of their three-sword energy art. After that, he told her to let him finish his meal before she left. After all the chaos, the feast with all the drinks finally happened. The mood inside the Aklan was calm and filled with a gentle peace. Yet, Yin Beck, the meticulous and calculating mastermind behind the Aklan estate, was the only one who couldn't let loose. The problem was that Dan Hyen had vanished during the party, leaving him worried because he knew the Black Viper could strike at any second, and he still didn't know how strong that boy really was. Baiwanik said he got the point, but asked who made him worry so much. But Yin Beck replied that the Black Viper was the most cowardly and vicious group in the world. He started to wonder if those people had been sneaking into the clan from the start, just biding their time until they could finally trick the clan leader into trusting them. Now was the perfect time to strike a surprise blow. The White Moon Corps of the Black Viper was already marching toward the Aklan estate. Dan Hyen Wu reappeared and insisted that those bad guys would never even get there. Immediately after, lightning struck the leader of the White Moon Corps. Dan Hyen Hu stepped forward and vowed that no one would be allowed to spoil his father's mood. As Zhou Yan watched him charge and thought, that's what a real father looks like. Dan Hyen Hu fought like a storm while a guard swore he seemed like a demon. The guard sprinted away in a panic to warn his clan that the Black Viper's army was attacking their home. Wangak and Yinbake said they had been expecting this, while Baiwanuk snapped for his sword to be brought right then. He even started to clean the alcohol out of his system so he could fight without being sick. The guard cut him off, saying the invaders had indeed come, but were already all wiped out. The guard claimed this demon had slaughtered every last member of the Black Vipers. While Dan Hainu slipped silently back to his seat unnoticed, Baiwen questioned the guard about his claim of seeing a demon, but the guard insisted he had witnessed a demon wiping everyone out before pointing at Baiwen, who snapped at him for calling him a demon. Panic-stricken, the guard quickly denied it and gestured for us to look behind him. Just then, Dan Hyun, who stepped forward calmly to tell his father he had returned. While at the scene of the Black Viper massacre, a man wondered if that squad had truly been sent to eliminate the Great Heaven Gate, since everyone was dead there. Dan Wall said the men were caught chasing a girl at a tavern in Chengdu. After hearing that, the leader shouted for everyone to find the girl right away, but another man cut him off, reminding the sect leader that they must first tell him that both the White Moon Corps and the Black Moon Corps had been completely wiped out. When he heard that, the leader flew into a rage and ordered them to find the remains of the Blue Moon Squad. For now, everyone headed back to base, but first he gathered all the Heavenly Thunders because it was time to wipe the Ackle clan off the map. The guests from Renee's escort agency spent the night at Ackland's estate, but by early morning, they were all getting ready to head home. Even as One Hai went about her day, she couldn't stop thinking about Dan Hyen, Hu, and Joe Seelan. She couldn't figure out why he was paying so much attention to that girl while barely noticing her, until Wang, A.K., cleared his throat and asked Miss Wuan Hai why his nephew's partner was making such a strange face this early in the morning. Wuan Hai stared in confusion and asked what he meant, while Wang A questioned if she wasn't actually Dan Han's fiancée. Woman Hai replied by wondering if that young lady really seemed interested in her that way. Wing then shared that the two of them acted just like siblings because of how they treated each other. She said she'd forget last night, if that was true, but Wang A insisted he had one last thing to talk about with Dan Haeyoung before they left. He explained that the Patriarch wanted to see him, but AKB-1 was at the training grounds as usual, practicing hard while thinking about what he'd heard the night before. Baiwen asked straight up if he really took down a whole Black Viper unit by himself and what fighting style he had learned. Dan decided to answer the Patriarch without disrespect, revealing that the technique was the 3-energy sword art, which he had learned directly from Cheonga and his master Dan Haeyeon, a sage who had taught them only the basics before they mastered the rest of the martial arts together. Once he heard that, Wuan Hai finally figured out the secret to his immense strength. Dan Haeyeon, who then revealed the shocking truth. Chung wasn't their master at all, but the very enemy who trapped them in that hell. Hearing that, Baiwen stopped talking for a second. Chung Jija was a strange mix of a kidnapper who took his son to his death and a teacher who later gave the clan valuable martial arts skills. Baiwen thought that maybe Kyonga taught those arts as a kind of reward. Even so, he knew that nothing in the whole world could ever make up for the death of his own son. Thinking hard, he smashed a wooden dummy in half to figure out his next move. Baiwen saw Dan Hyunu had come just to say goodbye and told him if that was what he wanted, then he could go. Then he guessed it must be the young lady, and Baiwen stared at him, realizing the last friend of his son was standing right there. Because of that, he looked at him not just as a friend, but as his own son. He told Dan Haeyeon that in Jangu, brute strength wasn't enough to fix everything. From then on, he had to watch his step carefully. After he asked Joe to look after his son, the porters rushed up to Joe's seal on the moment they returned to the group, worried and asking where she had gone and if she was okay. She apologized for causing worry, promised everything was okay, told them to get ready to head back to Hunan, and explained they would rebuild the escort agency upon arrival. Buane promised she had the Ackland support whenever she needed it, but then a porter sprinted over shouting that it was an emergency. The Black Viper men's friends were heading toward the tavern, and this time there were over 100 of them. Jo-sun instantly realized they were hunting her, while Dan Hyun wondered if it was the very same group from yesterday. He quietly promised to take care of everything by himself. He strolled to the balcony, convinced that everything was finally perfect for him. Danwall, the boss of the Black Viper gang, shouted for his men to charge in, grab the girl, and kill everyone inside the tavern. But one of his men yelled for him to look up, spotting a porter from the escort agency standing on the balcony. Soon after, everyone saw that Dan Hanho had leaped down from above. The men burst into laughter, convinced he was a total fool, even as Dan Wall watched with a smug grin. But that smile disappeared the very moment lightning struck the Black Viper men, smashing them into pieces. Dan Wall grew desperate, screaming out to know where that power came from and what terrifying martial art it was. Then Dan Hun Hune announced that the Black Viper gang would vanish right then and there, which is exactly what happened as he easily beat every member, leaving the poor agency porters to collect the scattered bodies on the ground. Josian apologized, saying she didn't want to force them to do that kind of work, but Hyungpyo replied that since they had been through this a few times already, it was probably fine. Even then, Joss couldn't stop worrying. She wondered if Dan Hon who could really survive facing the whole Black Viper sect alone, but when she looked around, she only saw a field of dead bodies. So Hyungpyo reassured her that Dan Hyen who would return safely. While inside the sect, the leaders gathered their 3 true heavenly thunderbolts to try and save them from disaster. The Thunder sect made these powerful bombs, but they were so hard to control that they once burned the sect down. Even so, the Black Viper leader was convinced that with the true heavenly thunderbolts, he could wipe out the Ackland estate and even take down the mighty Tang clan. Suddenly, a guard burst in to shout that Dan Wall was back. But he wasn't all there, because an unknown man was actually dragging him along. Dan Wall was absolutely terrified until Dan Honu asked if that was really the Black Viper sect. Dan Wall said yes and begged to get out right away, but Dan Hyen who warned that getting in looked like a real hassle. Desperate, Dan Wall told him the way to the sect lay through a confusing maze of connected houses known only to members, and while Dan Wall offered to guide him, Dan Hessel refused, saying it wasn't necessary. Then he kicked Dan Wall's body around like a ball and sent him flying far away. The body crashed through house after house, leveling everything in its path and carving a straight road straight to the sect's gate. With one sharp palm strike, Dan Hyen who knocked the poor man straight through the massive gates, leaving him to stand alone against the sect leader and his guards. The leader stood frozen in shock as Dan Hyen who tore through dozens of stone walls, even the enchanted ones, using only raw, unstoppable power. Still, the leader tried to hold his ground and admitted that no matter how powerful he was, he couldn't fight everyone by himself. But the answer struck us like lightning. A shower of electric beams hit the sect guards and wiped them all out in an instant. The wind howled like a violent storm while thunder roared, blasting the attackers' bodies into the air until only the sect leader stood alive, and then Dan Honu stepped forward to ask if he was the one who caused all the chaos. With nowhere else to turn, the leader unleashed the true heavenly lightning. The blast was so huge it blew the sect's ruins apart. The man started laughing and admitted the power was incredible, warning that if he hadn't steered the blast away, he could have died too. He shouted that even a powerful warrior god couldn't survive that attack. But from deep inside the fire, a voice asked if he was done speaking. Dan Hinhu stepped out of the flames without a scratch, and right then he called up an earth dragon that dove forward and swallowed the sect leader in one giant bite. And just like that, Dan Hyenhua finished the job and left the Black Viper sect in ruins. The last few survivors ran away in fear, screaming that he was the demon in the gray robe. Once the battle ended, Dan Hyenhu also grabbed the 2 heavenly lightning bombs the sect leader had been carrying. His actions left the escort agency holding 2 of those insanely dangerous weapons, which was certainly a huge win. Once the Black Viper sect was wiped out, whispers from the lucky few who escaped started flying through the land. Most of them were just workers or people who saw the massacre, and they all talked about the same scary sight, a gray demon. Word of the rumor raced across Sichuan so fast it vanished before anyone could blink, and before long, the Tang family heard it too. During the council meeting, many members couldn't believe what they were hearing. Everyone couldn't believe how the Black Viper sack could vanish in just one day. It made no sense at all. Then, Shuri Lai Tang, the head of the Sichuan Tang clan, said they had spent ages making special bombs just to take out the Black Viper sect. Seeing one person who could wipe out the whole organization meant a dangerous new group had likely risen in Sichuan, so he ordered his team to rush and find out everything right away. But the messenger replied that there was no group at all, only one person who had wiped out the entire Black Viper sect. Shitong couldn't believe that such a thing could be the work of just one person. It was simply too ridiculous to take seriously. The messenger confirmed that a survivor had verified the story, which made Peng Shalom believe the rumor was real and immediately ask if the spy wore gray clothes, to which the messenger agreed, prompting Koli Tang's uncle to wonder if he already knew who it was. And Peng Koliong began telling the entire story. After hearing everything, Choi